The Courtaulds factory at Halstead stood for 97 years. When demolition crews arrived in 1982, they found silk threads woven into the foundations, dated 1885. Samuel Courtauld III had ordered it done. A private superstition, silk in the bones of a building, that would make artificial silk. The site is a Tesco supermarket now. The car park covers what was once the weaving shed where 4,000 workers operated 24 hours a day. No plaque marks where the entrance stood. The local council discussed it in 1985, voted it down. Too expensive, they said. But that wasn't it. Halstead wanted to forget. The smell is what the old workers remember. Viscose Rayon production created a sulfurous stench that hung over the town like a chemical fog. You could taste it in your tea, said Marjorie Went, who worked in the spinning room from 1946 to 1979. The company provided milk to the workers, free milk, every shift. Not generosity, science. The calcium was supposed to protect against carbon disulfide poisoning. It didn't work well enough. Courtaulds paid compensation to 347 workers between 1952 and 1974 for nervous system damage. The files are sealed until 2045. Samuel Courtauld arrived in England in 1685, fleeing religious persecution in France. He brought nothing except a skill, silver working. His grandson, George Courtauld, established a silk mill in Bocking, Essex in 1816, with capital of £1,500 borrowed from 3 Quaker merchants. The business grew slowly. By 1825, the firm employed 43 workers and produced mourning crepe, black silk fabric for widows and funerals. Death was good business in Victorian Britain. When Prince Albert died in 1861, the Courtaulds factory worked triple shifts for 6 months straight. The profit from that single event, £47,000, equivalent to roughly £6 million today. Samuel Courtauld III inherited the business in 1891. He was 33 years old, educated at Rugby and Cambridge, and suffered from what his doctors called nervous exhaustion. Modern diagnosis, bipolar disorder. He spent 3 months every year at a Swiss sanatorium. His business decisions were made in bursts of manic energy, followed by months of withdrawal. In 1904, during one of his energetic phases, he read about a new material being developed in France, viscose rayon, an artificial silk made from wood pulp and chemicals. He became obsessed. He traveled to the Cheshire factory where British rights to the viscose process were being explored. The facility was failing. Production was unstable. The material degraded. Nobody could make it work commercially. Samuel bought the British viscose rights for £20,000 in 1904. His board of directors fought him. His own family questioned his sanity. The Courtauld silk business was thriving. Why risk everything on an unproven chemical process? Samuel didn't explain. He simply did it. He moved operations to Coventry, hired a chemist named Charles Frederick Topham, and gave him unlimited resources to solve the viscose problem. Topham worked for 2 years straight. The breakthrough came in 1906. By carefully controlling temperature and chemical ratios, viscose could be spun into stable, uniform fibers. By 1908, Courtaulds was producing commercial quantities of rayon. By 1910, the company had abandoned silk entirely. The Halstead factory opened in 1913. It was designed by Samuel himself, working with the architect Sir Edwin Lutyens. Samuel wanted a cathedral of industry. The main weaving shed measured 800 feet long and 300 feet wide, larger than Westminster Abbey. The ceiling was glass and steel, flooding the workspace with natural light. The spinning room featured white tile walls that could be cleaned with high-pressure steam. The chemical processing area was separated by a double-wall ventilation system, revolutionary for its time. It wasn't enough. The chemistry of rayon production was brutal. The process began with wood pulp, treated with caustic soda, to create alkali cellulose. This was shredded, aged, and then mixed with carbon disulfide to form sodium cellulose xanthate, a thick orange liquid with the consistency of honey. This viscose was forced through platinum spinnerets with holes measured in micrometers, extruding into a sulfuric acid bath where the fibers coagulated. The resulting rayon threads were washed, bleached, dried, and wound onto bobbins. Every stage produced toxic fumes. Carbon disulfide attacks the nervous system, causing tremors, vision problems, psychosis. Hydrogen sulfide smells like rotten eggs and causes respiratory failure at high concentrations. Caustic soda burns skin on contact. Courtaulds employed 7,000 workers at Halstead by 1925. The company built a medical facility on site with 4 full-time doctors and 2 dentists. Not benevolence, necessity. The workers were constantly ill. Respiratory infections were endemic, skin diseases common. The company provided subsidized housing, terraced homes on streets named after fibers. Rayon Road, Cellulose Street, Viscose Avenue. The houses had gardens and indoor plumbing, luxuries for working-class families in the 1920s. But they were company-owned. If you left Courtaulds, you left your home. The union tried to organize in 1926. The company fired 83 workers and evicted their families within a week. The union attempt collapsed. By 1930, Courtaulds controlled 74% of British rayon production and held patents that blocked competitors. Samuel Courtauld III had retired, replaced by professional managers who understood one thing: monopoly profit. The company diversified rapidly: rayon yarn for weaving, rayon staple fiber for mixing with cotton and wool, cellophane film made from viscose for packaging. Courtaulds bought the British rights to cellophane in 1929 for £500,000 and within 5 years dominated the UK market. The profit margins were extraordinary. Production costs for rayon fell throughout the 1930s as the chemical processes improved, but Courtaulds kept prices high. Between 1930 and 1939, the company's return on capital averaged 32% annually. The Second World War transformed Courtaulds from a textile company into a strategic asset. Rayon was essential for parachutes, tires, and aircraft fabric. The government designated Courtaulds a protected industry and exempted its workers from military conscription. The Halstead factory operated at maximum capacity throughout the war. 3 shifts, 7 days a week, no holidays. The workers were paid overtime but given no choice about working. Women were recruited in massive numbers. By 1943, 81% of the Halstead workforce was female. Many were mothers with children evacuated to the countryside. They lived in company dormitories and saw their children once a month if transport was available. Production accidents increased dramatically during the war. Carbon disulfide is highly flammable. On March 18, 1943, a flash fire in the xanthation room at Halstead killed 11 workers and injured 37 more. The inquest ruled it an industrial accident caused by a spark from defective electrical equipment. But internal company documents, released in 1998 under Freedom of Information requests, revealed something different. Management had known the equipment was faulty for 6 months, but delayed repairs to maintain production quotas. The families of the dead workers received £200 each in compensation. No criminal charges were filed. The local newspaper, which relied on Courtaulds' advertising revenue, reported the fire in 4 paragraphs on page 7. The 1950s brought a new threat: petrochemical synthetics. DuPont in America had developed nylon in 1935 and began mass production after the war. ICI in Britain was producing terylene, a polyester fiber that was stronger, cheaper, and easier to produce than rayon. These synthetics didn't require the toxic chemical processes of viscose. They were made from oil derivatives in relatively clean factories. They didn't smell. They didn't poison workers, and they were superior products: stronger, more durable, wrinkle-resistant, and quick-drying. Courtaulds responded with denial and lobbying. The company spent £2 million between 1952 and 1958 on advertising campaigns promoting natural rayon versus artificial synthetics. The irony was apparently lost on management. Rayon was itself an artificial fiber. The campaigns failed. British textile manufacturers switched to synthetics rapidly. By 1960, nylon and polyester had captured 43% of the UK artificial fiber market. Courtaulds' profits began to decline for the first time in 50 years. The company's response was to acquire competitors and diversify into synthetics themselves. Between 1957 and 1964, Courtaulds spent £87 million on acquisitions, buying up struggling textile firms across Lancashire, Yorkshire, and the Midlands. In 1961, Courtaulds negotiated a license to produce polyester under ICI patents. The Grimsby plant opened in 1963, producing Courtauld, the company's polyester brand. But Courtaulds was now competing in markets where it had no technical advantage and limited expertise. The acquisitions were poorly integrated. The new synthetic plants required different skills and management approaches. The company's traditional autocratic culture clashed with the more flexible operations needed for petrochemical manufacturing. In January 1962, ICI launched a hostile takeover bid for Courtaulds, offering £200 million, the largest corporate raid in British history at that time. ICI's logic was ruthless and sound. Courtaulds owned textile manufacturing capacity that ICI's synthetic fibers needed. By vertically integrating, ICI could control the entire chain from petrochemical production to finished garments. Courtaulds would become a captive market for ICI fibers. The Halstead factory would be closed. Viscose rayon would be phased out. Courtaulds fought back with a nationalist appeal. The company's chairman, Sir Frank Courtauld, went directly to Parliament, arguing that the takeover would create an unacceptable monopoly and threaten British textile manufacturing. Behind the scenes, Courtauld met with Harold Macmillan's government and made the case that ICI's dominance would hand control of strategic textile capacity to a petrochemical giant with no commitment to preserving British jobs. The labor opposition supported Courtaulds, seeing it as a defense of textile workers against corporate consolidation. The government intervened. The Board of Trade referred the merger to the Monopolies Commission, effectively killing it through delay. ICI withdrew the bid in March 1962, defeated not by Courtaulds' business case, but by political maneuvering. Sir Frank Courtauld became a hero in the financial press, the man who saved a British industrial icon from foreign domination. The irony, ICI was also British, but Courtauld had successfully framed the fight as textile tradition versus chemical capitalism. He won, but winning the takeover battle left Courtaulds with a more fundamental problem: what to do next. Courtaulds spent the next 2 decades expanding globally and diversifying desperately, trying to escape the declining viscose business that still generated most of its cash flow. The company bought textile firms in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. It acquired paint manufacturers, trying to leverage its chemical expertise. It purchased clothing brands, attempting vertical integration into retail. By 1975, Courtaulds operated 327 separate factories in 19 countries, employed 132,000 workers, and had become incomprehensible. Nobody, including senior management, understood what Courtaulds actually did anymore. The company was simultaneously a rayon producer, a polyester manufacturer, a paint maker, a clothing retailer, and a dozen other things. Strategic planning became impossible. Capital allocation was political, decided by whichever division had the most influential board representation. The original viscose business at Halstead continued operating, increasingly obsolete but still profitable, due to specialized industrial markets that required rayon's specific properties: medical textiles, tire cord, industrial filters. The workforce at Halstead declined steadily: 7,000 workers in 1925, 4,000 in 1960, 1,800 in 1975. The remaining workers were older, skilled, and loyal. Many had worked at Courtaulds for their entire adult lives. But the company stopped investing in the Halstead plant. Equipment wasn't replaced. Buildings weren't maintained. The white tiles in the spinning room, once cleaned daily, turned brown and cracked. The glass ceiling of the main weaving shed leaked when it rained. Workers set out buckets to catch the water. Management didn't care. The strategy, never explicitly stated, was to run Halstead into the ground whilst extracting maximum cash flow. The textile workers' strike of 1979 was the beginning of the end. Courtaulds announced plans to close 16 factories and shed 12,000 jobs. The union demanded negotiations. The company refused. Workers at the Courtaulds Skelmersdale plant walked out on March 15, 1979. The strike spread rapidly. By April, 37 Courtaulds facilities were shut down, including Halstead. The company responded with an ultimatum: return to work or face permanent closure of striking plants. The strike lasted 4 months. It was bitter, violent, and widely covered in the national press. Margaret Thatcher, newly elected Prime Minister in May 1979, refused to intervene. seeing it as a test case for her government's stance on union power. The union fractured internally. Older workers, terrified of losing pensions, voted to return to work. Younger workers, with less to lose, wanted to continue fighting. On July 12, 1979, the union leadership capitulated, accepting the factory closures in exchange for improved redundancy packages. Halstead was scheduled for closure in September 1982. The announcement came on November 3, 1981, a Wednesday afternoon just before the end of the shift. Management gathered the workers in the main weaving shed and read a prepared statement. The factory would cease operations within 10 months. All jobs would be eliminated. The site would be sold for redevelopment. Questions were not permitted. Workers were escorted back to their stations to complete the shift. Marjorie Went, who had worked at Halstead for 33 years, later described the moment. "They treated us like criminals, like we'd done something wrong. We'd made them rich for a century, and they couldn't even look at us." Courtaulds didn't die. It was dismembered. Between 1982 and 1990, the company systematically sold off profitable divisions to prop up failing ones, desperately trying to maintain its stock price whilst corporate raiders circled. The paint business was sold to ICI in 1986 for £430 million. The acetate business went to Hoechst for £300 million in 1987. The clothing brands were spun off into a separate company, Courtaulds Textiles, in 1990. What remained was the original viscose business, now called Courtaulds Fibers, producing rayon for increasingly niche industrial applications. The financial engineering became absurd. Courtaulds took on massive debt to fund shareholder dividends, maintaining the illusion of profitability whilst the underlying business collapsed. Between 1985 and 1995, the company paid out £1.2 billion in dividends, whilst accumulating £800 million in debt. The board, led by CEO Sir Christopher Hogg, repeatedly claimed they were restructuring for growth, whilst actually liquidating assets to generate cash. The institutional shareholders, pension funds, and insurance companies supported this strategy because it maintained short-term returns. Nobody wanted to admit that Courtaulds had no viable future. The Halstead site was sold to a property developer in 1985 for £2.7 million. The factory buildings were demolished over 6 months, from January to June 1986. Workers who had been made redundant 4 years earlier came to watch. Some brought cameras. Gordon Finch, who had worked in the chemical processing area for 41 years, stood outside the fence on the final day of demolition and filmed the collapse of the main weaving shed. "I wanted evidence," he said later, "evidence that it existed, that we existed." The footage is 7 minutes long, silent, showing clouds of dust rising as the steel framework buckles and falls. It's archived at the Essex Record Office. Nobody watches it. Courtaulds Textiles, the spun-off clothing division, survived as a zombie brand through the 1990s and 2000s. The company no longer manufactured anything. It licensed the Courtaulds name to garment makers in Bangladesh, China, and Vietnam, who produced clothes sold under various sub-brands in British department stores. The executives who ran Courtaulds Textiles had never worked in a factory, never seen viscose production, never met the workers who built the original company. They were financial professionals managing intellectual property. In 2000, Courtaulds Textiles was bought by Sara Lee Corporation, an American food and consumer goods conglomerate, for £600 million. Sara Lee wanted the brand portfolio for its hosiery division. 3 years later, Sara Lee sold the Courtaulds textile brands to Hong Kong-based PD Enterprise for £180 million, taking a massive loss. PD Enterprise continued the licensing model, gradually allowing the Courtaulds name to disappear from the market. By 2010, no garments sold in Britain carried the Courtaulds label. The original viscose business had an even stranger fate. Courtaulds Fibres was acquired by AkzoNobel, a Dutch chemical conglomerate, in 1998 for £340 million. AkzoNobel kept the viscose plants running in the UK for 7 more years, then closed them in 2005, shifting production to facilities in China and India, where environmental regulations were less stringent and labor costs negligible. The last Courtaulds branded rayon produced in Britain came off the line at the Spondon plant in Derbyshire on the 30th of November 2005. The workers were given 30 minutes notice that it was the final shift. There is no Courtaulds company today. The name exists as a trademark owned by various entities with no connection to the original business. The factories are gone, demolished, converted, forgotten. The Halstead Tesco was refurbished in 2019. The new design includes a small historical display near the entrance, 3 panels with photographs of the old factory, and a brief text explaining that an important textile mill once stood on this site. The display was created by a local history group after lobbying the supermarket chain for 3 years. It cost £8,000, funded by a Heritage Lottery grant. The human legacy is dispersed and fading. Former Courtaulds workers are now in their 70s, 80s, 90s. Their children mostly left Halstead, moving to cities for employment. The skills they possessed, the ability to judge viscose consistency by touch, to tune a spinneret by sound, to identify chemical contamination by smell, are extinct. No institution trains these skills anymore. No industry needs them. When Marjorie Went died in 2018 at the age of 91, her obituary in the Halstead Gazette mentioned that she worked in textiles. No details, no explanation. The knowledge died with her. The financial legacy is easier to trace and more disturbing. Courtaulds' pension fund, which covered 43,000 former employees, was dramatically underfunded when the company was broken up. A series of complex legal battles between 1998 and 2006 resulted in pension payments being cut by an average of 42% for workers who retired between 1980 and 1995. The Pension Protection Fund eventually absorbed the shortfall, but thousands of former Courtaulds employees spent the last decades of their lives receiving substantially less than they'd been promised after working for 30, 40, 50 years. The chemical legacy persists in ways nobody discusses publicly. Soil contamination at former Courtaulds sites remains significant. A 2014 environmental assessment of the Halstead site, obtained through Freedom of Information requests by environmental campaigners, revealed carbon disulfide residues in groundwater at levels 40 times above safe limits. The report recommended further investigation and possible remediation. Nothing has been done. The Tesco car park sits on top of it. The chemical cathedral left poison in its foundations, and the poison remains, leaching slowly into the earth, invisible, persistent, ignored.